tell them apart. Can't tell me to run, but I can. 'Cause I go.
You are with Breakfast. Thank you for your company. Voting for the election closes at 7 p.m. on Saturday. Early voting is at record levels. Many of you will have already voted, but some of you won't have. And according to the most recent One News Colmar Brunton poll, roughly 13% of us, well, last Thursday anyway, were still undecided, like these people here.
It's definitely going under the rug too much, though. Nobody really knows what they're voting for, you know?
I don't know. It's all kind of jumbled up, and some parties are good for some things and some aren't for others.
Didn't really know too much about it, to be honest. I haven't voted for a long time. So.
Just different information comes out all the time, yes. So it's making it hard.
You know, it used to be a simple choice of economy, etc., but it's not that simple anymore.
I don't know who to vote for.
You can tell that people want to get it right too. We do know the economy is playing a lot on people's minds, so to help unpack party policies around the economy, we're joined by Max Rashbrooke, who is a Senior Associate at the Institute for Government and Policy Studies at Victoria University and is the 2020 JD Stout Fellow, beaming in from Tauranga. Max, nice to have you with us. Thank you so much. If you see Simon Bridges and Todd Muller, I think they should give Judith Collins some support as they hide there in Tauranga. And Eric Crampton, the Chief Economist at the New Zealand Initiative. Morena Korua, it's nice to have you with us, Max. And Eric, thank you both for joining us. Eric, we've got you on camera now, so we're going to stay with you. We should say, actually, just before we go on, for the purposes of clarity, that, and this is a broad, sweeping generalisation, but we've gone for people whose record of advocacy and whose writing reflects somewhat different positions on the political spectrum. So we're hoping to cover a reasonable gamut. But agreement is also possible here. We're really grateful for both of you. Eric, if we're talking about the economy, what are the most meaningfully transformative policies? Let's start with the big two parties, so National and Labour. If people are worried about the economy, what are the policies they need to know about?
Sure. So if we look back even prior to COVID, I think the most important one has been housing and getting housing affordability on track. So I'd heard lots of your correspondents in the sidewalk interviews talking about how they're not quite sure which parties are proposing which things. I'd recommend they all go have a look at the spin-off sort of roundup of the different parties' policies at policy.nz. So you can check all of those. On housing, Labour's not made much progress over the past 3 years in getting towards housing affordability. Of course, things have gotten worse, but they have put in a few of the background policies that could start making things better. So there have been some changes to infrastructure financing that'll help. There have been some changes around the urban development authorities and the national policy statement for urban planning that should help. Labour would be expected to continue those. All parties are talking about revising the RMA, changing that.
Yes, they are.
National's focused on that, but that's a really long-term process. Housing affordability really matters. Labour's established a bit of credibility in that area under what the reforms that Minister Twyford's put through.
Max, I want to bring you in here because I know, and we all know, and this is a conversation we were having with David Seymour before, that the more of your household income you spend on accommodation, the less you have for everything else, right? That's a statement of fact. But that's what amplifies inequality, because people are paying rents and simply running out. And the material hardship measure tells us that there are a significant number of New Zealanders who aren't regularly able to buy the things they need and pay the bills they need. So housing policy that meaningfully addresses that is coming from whom, Max?
Well, I think one of all the parties have got housing policies, of course, because it's front and centre of people's minds. One of the things that I think is too often missing from the equation is public housing.
Yes.
You know, because we have about the same number of state houses now that we had in the early 1990s, even though the population has increased hugely in that time. You know, if we'd built state houses at a rate that just kept pace with population increases, we'd have about another 20,000 state houses today, which would be enough to house every single one of the 40,000 odd people who are registered as homeless in the censuses. So I think that's something that people really need to be looking at. Yes, the housing market will deliver for some people, but the market will not deliver housing for everyone. What are we doing for the people for whom the market doesn't deliver?
And Max, and Eric, I'm going to ask you the same question, but and feel free to take the fifth and recuse yourself from answering this, but is there a policy you think from any of the parties that addresses that shortfall of public housing, state housing?
I think the fundamental issue is that we just don't have...
Eric, we'll start with Max, and then we'll come to you in a sec, Eric.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's great that Labor is promising an extra 8,000 state houses over 4 years. The Greens have a policy of basically trying to build enough houses to clear the backlog on the state house waiting lists. I think those are really important. I'd also like to see a bit more thought given to how we're building those houses, though. Could we be making more use of prefabrication technique, better designed state houses, more environmentally friendly ones, because it's not just the quantity, it's also the quality.
Yeah, okay. Eric, how do we address this extraordinary waiting list for state housing? And who is most likely to do that, do you think?
I think the biggest problem is just that we have a shortage of housing, full stop. So that's reflected then in the pressure we're seeing on state housing, but it's because we just don't have enough houses. And the reason for that is that local councils face pretty pernicious incentives around allowing more housing to happen. None of the parties have put up anything credible in making local councils sort of share in the benefits of allowing more housing. ACT has kind of gone there a bit. The top party has suggested getting GST on construction back to council, so they got one fewer reason to say no. Alleviating that shortage will take the pressure off across the board, and then we can start looking at state housing. I think that one of the reasons that Kiwi Build had a lot of problems is they were hitting all of the same problems in consenting and everything else around infrastructure that all private developers hit.
Yeah, Eric, I'm going to stay with you, and then Max, I'm going to ask you the same thing. But tribal politics is really interesting because the tribes stand off and glare at each other as if there was the biggest difference in the world between them. But it seems to me that, give or take a few exceptions on the edge, if we compare Goldsmith with Robertson, there is a caution and an orthodoxy in their approach to the post-pandemic world. Did you hope for more from the two main parties, Eric?
I was hoping that we'd see a little bit more taking up the opportunities that New Zealand's really strong COVID response has given us. So right now, all parties are kind of looking at managing a decline, facing a global recession. How do we deal with that? Labor's put up a few policies around make work programs and a little bit more business funding. Nationals put up some programs around tax cuts. Nobody's really talked about scaling up the managed isolation system in ways that could enable a whole pile more activity to be happening here. So we wouldn't be needing those other ranges of government support. Pouring money into that system could enable all kinds of other things to happen.
Max, can I come to you on this? Are you surprised by how, and this is a pejorative term, and you can disabuse me of it if you think I'm being too strong, cautious both major parties have been?
Yeah, no, I think that's really fair. And what I see is almost all the major parties being far too concerned about what are actually really very modest levels of public debt. Our public debt is probably going to be 40-something% of GDP. There are most of developed nations around the world, well, a lot of them have debts that are twice that high. We've had far higher debts in the past, post-World War II, and we've paid them off slowly and sensibly. What I'm disappointed about is that we're not seeing more parties recognise that actually now's the time to be investing. Let's solve child poverty. Let's mitigate climate change. The sooner we do those things, the cheaper they are. The longer we put them off, the more expensive they get. Government can borrow at some of the cheapest rates on record. I think we should be investing now to solve those long-term problems, which are the right things socially and environmentally, but will also build a stronger economy. Fewer kids in poverty, less talent wasted, a more productive workforce in the future, adapting to climate change early. They're all good things economically, I think.
So Max, I want to stay with you, and then Eric, I'm going to ask you the same question. But Max, do you feel like in being orthodox, in worrying about debt, which Treasury says is going to peak at 53% of GDP, which is still way, way lower than the UK and the United States are starting their pandemic responses with, way, way lower than debt levels in many comparable nations. Do you think we've squandered the opportunity that COVID possibly provided us with, and that is the silver lining of COVID was that we could take stock and start again? Do you think we're not doing that?
Yeah, I think you have to give some allowances because pandemics are incredibly disruptive periods, and so much effort from government and from businesses, from everyone, just goes into keeping the furniture intact. And I totally understand that. And you have to give the government, make some allowances for that. But to some extent, yes, we have had a chance to do a real reset, to really put the environment front and centre, to really invest in people, to invest massively in retraining, different ways of doing things, different ways of managing the economy. And I think, we have missed that opportunity because, National inherently is a Conservative party, that's its nature and that's fine. And actually the Labour Party is a very cautious, very conservative one. Not a lot of the new thinking that should have happened has happened. And they're still largely actually working in an old paradigm, I think.
Eric, can we come to you on that? And I guess I'd like you to pick up on the point Max was making, but can we broaden out and say that actually where the risks are being taken and where the imagination is apparent is in some of them, quote, minor, end quote, parties, ACT and the Greens, for example, the Māori Party top. You are actually seeing more imaginative policies there, aren't you?
Well, you always will from the fringe parties. I think that we're under-recognizing some bits of transformation that has happened. The emissions trading scheme now has a binding cap that is set to decline over time in line with some of our commitments. It's the primary policy instrument. Agriculture needs to come into it yet. There is a path for getting there by 2025 if they haven't come up with another alternative. That will matter a lot. And I think that a lot of the environmental policies that have come up have failed to recognize that we now have this binding cap that we should be relying on. I also worry a lot more about debt than Max does. A lot of these bigger countries have much larger economies that are more diverse and across a broader area. If we got hit with the Wellington Fault and the Southern Alpine Fault opening up in the next couple of years, we'd be in really big trouble. We need to be able to maintain capacity to take on substantially more debt in a really big hurry, and that means getting debt back down to the kinds of levels that have been prudent previously. So we need to keep worrying about that. National has a bit of a plan to get debt to GDP ratios back down. They've had a few problems in getting their numbers to line up, but it should still be front of mind, as well as value for money in the programs. We shouldn't just be spending because debt is cheap. There's plenty of things that need to be done. In a recession, the cost of getting some of those things done are a bit lower because you've got more unemployed people around, but the focus shouldn't be on just spending money for the sake of it. It should be on checking which programs are now affordable that might not have been, and making sure that there's still rigor in the cost-benefit assessment for them.
Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative, thank you for coming in this morning. We really appreciate it. And I love the robust assessment of what we've seen from kind of slightly different parts of the political spectrum. Max, we started with Eric, so I want to end with you. Max Rashbrooke, why should people vote? So people who are undecided, who don't yet know who they want to vote for, why should they make the effort to find the party for themselves and get out and vote between now and 7 p.m. Saturday?
Because I think everything that people are surrounded by is affected in one way or another by the government that they elect. If people are sitting at home watching this, the quality of their house, is it safe? Is it warm? Is it dry? That depends an awful lot on government regulations. The safety of their streets, their ability to get to and from work on public transport or on roads that are properly regulated. Every second of our lives, we depend on stuff that the government does. The only way you can influence that right now is by turning up and voting.
Thanks, Max. That's a hell of a good note to end on. We really appreciate it. Max Rashbrooke and Eric Crampton joining us, beaming and live this morning. We set ourselves a big task, but I really appreciate the zeal and insight with which you approached it. Thank you, you two.
Thank you.